And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about hot takes. So this string of reactions and comments started over on the New York Minute. There'll be links to all this in the show notes. And yesterday, Team Apex released a show, and while I've already responded to some of this within the Versus Community Discord, I am going to take an episode of the show to respond to it here as well, because that's fun. So, let's tackle some of these hot takes. Now, if I remember correctly, the original hot take was that groupthink is harming the community and preventing people from finding solutions, which it's like, so Bert does these hot take shows and it's anonymous. He doesn't say who he got the hot takes from, but like, come on, you use a phrase like finding solutions. You might as well have prefaced this with like, Team Apex is responsible for the contents of this hot take. So Bert pushed back against it a little bit, and I'm inclined to agree with a lot of what he said in that it's not groupthink if two separate testing groups test the same pool of cards and come to similar conclusions. So, to represent what Vern's comment was, is about how the podcasts maybe have influence on what other people are playing. And by listening to the content that's out there in the community, people tend to I don't want to misrepresent Vern here, but the way I understood his argument was that the influence of prominent tournament players or content creators giving their 2 cents on the meta makes predicting the meta easier to do because you know some amount of people are just going to play what those people think is good. And if Vern says that wasn't exactly what he meant, I grant that to him. That was my takeaway from it, but I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. I think that's exactly wrong. I think saying that the Versus community suffers from groupthink largely misses the point of what's actually going on, and using a term like groupthink, which is built in, kind of has a pejorative history. Groupthink is not a good thing. It's something major corporations employ consultants to try to help avoid this kind of thing. So I don't think we can fairly spin that comment as not having like there was some talk on the Apex podcast like, oh, I'm not calling people out, I'm not, well, and then he kind of owned it at the end because yeah, calling it groupthink is, I think we can agree, a bit of a pejorative. And so here's what I think is actually happening. I think, yes, some of the louder mouths in the community are going to have some influence over what other people think. But this is not a case of simply spouting off with opinion. I think everybody who takes the time to make content for this game does it because they love the game. And while I'm a little more public about the fact that I play more games than just Versus, I wouldn't be here doing the show if I didn't play a lot of Versus and love Versus a great deal. It is by far my favorite game. And I think that's probably true of all the content creators. Like, why would you make content for a game if you're not playing the game and enjoying the game? Like, kind of seems like enjoyment of the game has to come first. And to me, just take for an example, Midwinter, a couple years back, Midwinter 22. I went on at great length about how I thought Flash Thompson was not only the best main character in the format, but one of the best main characters Super Awesome Games had ever put out. And other people played Flash Thompson. Now, I don't think other people played Flash because I talked about how much I liked him or because of how powerful I thought he was. I think other people played him because he was a really good main character. And a lot of times, the formats where everybody's on Outriders or the Thorigens where everybody was on Thor, this isn't a case of players not putting in the reps to find what works for them. This is a case of players putting in the reps and realizing, hey, this is a really strong deck. Now, one of the subpoints here, and I would argue it's actually kind of a whole separate discussion, is the idea of doing well with a mid-lane MC. And there's been a couple arguments put forward about this. Now, anybody who's listened to my show, or any of my shows that I've done about tournament prep, has to be aware that I fully believe you should always go to an event playing the main character that you're most familiar with, that you like the most, that you think is the best for you. I have always maintained that tier lists within a format are more a tool for instructing you on how you build your gauntlet and how you do your testing than they are a prescriptive list of you should play these. I have been to tournaments where I've played the tier 1 MC. I've been to tournaments where I've played tier 3 MCs. I think just because a character has a good showing, it doesn't make them not where they're at on the tier list. And just because somebody shows up to an event with a tier 1 main character doesn't mean that they're only playing that character because of where it's at on the tier list. Now these aren't black and white. This isn't a binary where you're either playing a main character because it's the best or you're playing a main character because you like it the best. There's sliders on both of those variables, and it could very well be a situation where I'm on a main character that I think is tier 1, and then I put the work in to make that tier 1 powerhouse work for me as a player. There are definitely people who go, I'm just going to play the best cards. And people have varying degrees of success with that. Somebody like Smallwood talks pretty commonly about how he just plays the best cards and relies on his ability to navigate the situations, and it works out to great success. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. Not everybody can play an aggro deck. Not everybody can play a control deck. So there is definitely an element of personal preference and personal responsibility in what you choose to bring to a tournament. But to round up the entire idea of there being a meta as the outcome of people listening to other people and not forming their own opinions, I just think that that's silly. I think that's not paying attention to the community. We have a lot of different opinions. Even within his own podcast, Vern talked about how his group had an opinion on an MC that a lot of people wrote off and then piloted it to some success. Now that right there is a case of sort of bucking the groupthink. Now I remember these events and thinking, wow, X23 has some game, but she's super vulnerable to Devil Slayer. Like all it takes is a couple of people running Devil Slayers and you're just going to have a terrible matchup in the room. Now X23, when she doesn't run into Devil Slayer, can be quite good. But this idea that you're going to take a main character and be like, okay, nobody's going to see this coming. Well, break that sentence down a little bit. If what your MC requires in order to have, or is counting on in order to have success, is taking people by surprise, playing this character against people who maybe didn't test this character as much because they're not one of those tier 1 threats, well, right there within all of those assumptions, you've baked in the idea that if someone had adequate testing against that main character, that it's a beatable matchup. Like, if the main character you're on requires the element of surprise, then your main character probably isn't a bad matchup. I played the Runaway Chopper deck, and I was very clear about how this deck absolutely required the element of surprise. And in my top cut matchup, my top 4 game, my opponent realized in game, he didn't catch on in game 1, but by game 2 he caught on to the fact that if he just never attacks Sister Grimm, I can't ever do my combo. And unfortunately he happened to be on a deck that was also on an alternate win condition, and therefore he could just wait me out and I had no way to win. But it took him a game to figure that out. Does that mean that Sister Grimm is a tier 1 main character because when she has the element of surprise, she can do better in matchups than she probably has any right to? No, that doesn't make any sense. So I fully reject the idea that different play groups within the Versus community coming to similar conclusions about power levels of cards, while still, you pick any specific card, and there's definitely some disagreements about it. Like, again, within his own Hot Take podcast, Vern talked about how he disagrees with other people about Dark Phoenix. So it's certainly possible that people can have differing opinions, but the broad strokes of, hey, Loki is really good, hey, Buffy's probably mid-tier, these are things that I think we can be honest about. Like, a low tier or mid tier MC doing well in an event. Yes, it relies on luck to some degree, but so does every game. I totally agree with Vern on that point. It's just silly to pretend that anybody ever makes it to the finals of a card game event and that they didn't at some point throughout Swiss or throughout Top Cut have luck go their way. Luck is always a part of these games because variance is a part of these games. So I totally concede that. I think it's a little silly to say, "Oh, well Buffy only did that well cuz she got lucky." Sure, that's true, but like that's also true of people playing Outriders. Sometimes they win matches that maybe they shouldn't have because they got lucky. So no matter how good your deck is, there's some variance involved. So I don't think that different playgroups coming to similar conclusions about how good or bad a certain card is an example of groupthink. I think this is an expression of the high level of skill and dedication to the game that we have within our community, and the fact that different playgroups come to not identical but generally similar conclusions shows that we're all doing the homework. It is hard to take this community by surprise. It does happen every once in a while. The most recent like big surprise that I think I remember seeing was how good Illustrated Cloak is against Outriders, particularly when paired with the Kate Kane MC. I think that was a John Phillips. If you're not John Phillips, you can't surprise this community. That's not entirely true. There are other mad scientists out there. But I think rounding everybody who plays whatever the tier 1 main character is down to sheep who just do what other people think, I think that's unfair. I don't think that's a fair way to characterize the Versus community. And there's examples of people who buck those kinds of trends all over the place. And it's not just people who do it with passion project MCs. There's strong MCs that maybe aren't tier 1 that people hop on. So if you're on tier 2 because you think it has a good matchup against the tier 1 decks, does that mean you're not part of the groupthink or you are part of I think this all just falls apart. Every individual player has their own approach to how to play the best game for themselves. And I think we all get better over time by listening to each other's thought process and learning from each other's decks. Is that groupthink? I don't think that's a fair way to characterize the sort of beneficial, almost symbiotic relationship that, when I sit down at the card table, of course I want to win. But there's a phrase that I've heard around the gym a number of times: we either win or we learn. And when I'm learning from a loss in a card game, that's an experience that only I'm having. Now I can try to share that with other people, and if somebody else is able to learn from my experience, I don't think becoming a better card player on the back of other people's misplays means you're guilty of groupthink. I just reject that one. I'm not going to touch the Dark Phoenix thing today. I don't feel like it. All right, Vern, ball's in your court. You can shoot back if you want. If you like what we're doing here, patreon.com/thebuildphase. Shout out to all my patrons. They keep the lights on around here. And if you'd like to join us in the coolest clubhouse in Versus, patreon.com/thebuildphase. This has been the Build Phase Podcast. I am Mr. Ben. Go win some games.